Okay, let's talk about the trigeminal system and brainstem strokes. It's going to be quick and dirty. It can be very confusing for some people, so I'm going to make it as simple as possible. The first place I start is I think about the spinal cord. I think about the major efferent motor and afferent sensory tracts that we know in the spinal cord. So the one efferent motor I think of as the corticospinal tract. And then I think of three afferent sensory tracts: the dorsal column, which contains vibration, proprioception, and fine touch; spinal thalamic tract, which contains pain, temperature, and crude touch; and muscle spindles, which convey information on muscle stretch. So the face is no different than the body. It needs this information. And so these tracts exist. It's just that they're all in the trigeminal nerve, either leaving efferent or coming in as sensory fibers. And instead of these names and these tracks, they go to four discrete nuclei in the brainstem that we consider as part of the trigeminal system. So here's a coronal section of the brainstem from the Haynes Atlas. It's half the brainstem, so medial is to the left and lateral is to the right. Rostral is up and caudal is down. And these blobs are different nuclei in the brainstem, and the numbers correspond to a legend that is in the Haynes Atlas. So that's not relevant for this video, so just ignore the numbers. They don't correspond to cranial nerve numbers. Okay, the first thing you'll notice is efferent nuclei are on the left or more medial, and afferent or more lateral, and they're separated by the sulcus limitans. So sulcus limitans is an embryologic delineation between nuclei, the neurons that form efferent nerves, and the nuclei that form afferent nuclei and neurons. And so if we just transpose what I mentioned in the spinal cord to the brainstem for the face, we have one efferent tract, which instead of the corticospinal tract, it's going to innervate muscles of mastication, and it's going to come from the motor trigeminal nucleus. So that's here, that's number 7. And it's medial to the sulcus limitans because it's motor. Then we need information on these muscles and their stretch, and that's because you don't want to close your jaw and shatter your teeth. So you need to have some sort of proprioception. And that goes to the mesencephalic nucleus, which is denoted as number 4, and that is in the midbrain. Then we need light touch and proprioception. So instead of the dorsal column, we have the principal sensory nucleus of 5, and that's here, number 9. Now, it's also known as chief sensory nucleus of 5 and the main trigeminal sensory nucleus. So unfortunately, everything in neuroscience has 3 names, and so you just have to memorize that. So now we need information from the face on pain, crude touch, and temperature. And instead of the spinal thalamic tract, we have the spinal trigeminal nucleus. And don't be confused by the word trigeminal in spinal trigeminal nucleus, because it's not just for cranial nerve 5, it also gets inputs from 7, 9, and 10. So there are 2 things you can appreciate about the trigeminal system. First is that it's confusing, of course, and second is that these nuclei are pretty spaced out, so different brainstem strokes will cause different symptoms. And if you know where these different nuclei are, then you can localize where the stroke is based on symptoms in the face. So here's a confusing slide. It's going to show the blood supply to the brainstem, and I'm going to try to make it simple. So on the left we have the names of blood vessels, and on the right we have different structures in the brainstem. And I'm going to label blood vessels that primarily serve the medial parts of the brainstem with red, lateral with blue, or both with purple. And just to remind you, these are the cranial nerve nuclei that are in the brainstem, and those that are served by medial branches are red and lateral by blue. It's not so black and white, but just for quick memorization, that's how you remember it. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the posterior cerebral artery, superior cerebellar artery, basilar, ICA or anterior inferior cerebellar artery, PICA, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and the ASA or anterior spinal artery. and these will serve different parts of. So we're going back to this coronal section of the brainstem, and we're going to look at where those different blood vessels provide nutrients. And the colors will remain mostly the same. So the posterior cerebral artery is going to serve the midbrain. The basilar artery is mostly medial, but it can extend long branches around the pons towards the lateral aspect, but I labeled it red to make it clear that it is coming from the medial portion. The superior cerebellar artery is lateral, and that will serve the rostral pons and maybe some of the midbrain. Ica will supply the caudal pons, caudal lateral pons. Anterior spinal artery is medial medulla, and pica is the lateral medulla. So, if we had a PCA stroke, what symptoms in the trigeminal system would you expect to see? So it's covering over the mesencephalic nucleus. So you're going to lose that myotatic reflex or the jaw jerk reflex because that's where the muscle spindle information goes. If you had a basilar stroke, you would certainly hit the corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts that run through the anterior medial pons. But you could also hit the motor nucleus of 5, which innervate the muscles of mastication, and the facial motor nucleus of 7. That's not part of the trigeminal system, but it does innervate the muscles of facial expression, so it's important to know that it's in this territory. A superior cerebellar artery infarct, or SCA, will certainly hit the principal sensory nucleus of 5, so you lose light touch and proprioception. You could lose the myotatic reflex, and you could hit the motor nucleus of 5 and lose the muscles of mastication. So the SCA is more rostral in the pons. In the caudal pons is where the Ica territory is, so that's going to hit the spinal trigeminal nucleus, so you'll lose pain and temperature to the ipsilateral face, and you could lose the muscles of facial expression from cranial nerve 7. And so just so you know, it's important to be able to look at a section of the pons and know whether you're in the rostral part of the pons or the caudal part of the pons, because you could see two different symptoms. Anterior spinal artery likely will not affect any nuclei in the trigeminal system, but pica will hit the spinal trigeminal nucleus because it runs all the way down into the medulla from the pons. And so you can lose pain and temperature sensation from the ipsilateral face. Here is everything together, just so you can see it all in the same place, and that is it. Thank you very much. I hope this was helpful.